who keeps returning to the same cafe, unaware that the woman behind the counter is raising his child. Nina thought the past was safely buried, one anonymous form, one clinic visit, one choice made in silence. But when a quiet man with familiar eyes becomes a regular at her cafe, something begins to stir. Her son is only 4, but some resemblances are hard to explain. And some truths don't stay hidden forever. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The cafe opened at 6:30 a.m., but Nina was always there by 6. She liked the quiet, the kind that lived in the hum of machines warming up and the sharp hiss of the first espresso shot. It gave her 30 minutes of silence before the city outside roared to life, and that was often the only silence her day would offer. The place wasn't much, just a narrow corner tucked between a dry cleaners and the fertility clinic across the street. But it was hers in a way that mattered. She'd worked there for almost 5 years. First part-time, then full, and eventually as the one who trained the others and fixed the machines when no one else could. The owner, Lena, mostly handled books and suppliers now, leaving Nina as the steady heartbeat of the place. Her son, Elias, still asleep upstairs in the little apartment they shared above the cafe, had come into her life quietly too. A choice made with trembling hands and quiet certainty. No names, no romantic promises. Just science and hope and a single line on a form. Donor number 2461, open to contact at 18. She never wondered who he was. That was the point. She needed clarity, not complication. A child born not out of heartbreak or chaos, but out of decision. But sometimes clarity doesn't last. The first time he came in, she didn't look up right away. It was the middle of a Monday rush and she was 2 drinks behind, trying not to burn milk or lose her rhythm. He waited without sighing, without tapping his foot, just stood there quietly until it was his turn. Double espresso. No sugar. His voice was calm, deep, precise. She glanced up briefly, took the order, made the drink. He paid in cash. No small talk. Just a quick thanks and a nod before walking out. The second time, he sat down. Not at the window, not near the counter, just one of the back tables where the light hit the floor in long stripes. He brought a laptop. Typed a lot. Barely looked around. For 2 weeks, he came in almost every morning at the same time, ordered the same drink, and sat at the same table. The third week, Nina started noticing things. Like the way he watched the espresso pour. Not impatiently, but analytically, like he was mentally timing it. The way he held the cup, fingers wrapped cleanly around it, but never touching the rim. The way he never took phone calls in the cafe. Never scrolled. Never wore headphones. And the way once he smiled just barely when she handed Elias a paper cup of steamed milk before daycare. "You made that for him?" he asked, almost conversational. Nina blinked. "It's just warm milk. He likes to think it's coffee." He glanced at the boy. "How old?" 4. Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to name. He nodded, thanked her, and returned to his table. Later, when she replayed that look in her head, her stomach twisted. The resemblances were small. The same tilt of the head. The same quiet stare when thinking. Even the way Elias lined up his toy dinosaurs with surgical precision across the table during her late shifts, just like this man organized his papers. Coincidence, she told herself. And yet, she didn't ask his name. Not because she didn't want to know, but because not knowing felt safer. Safer than confirming a fear she had no right to have. But she couldn't stop noticing. When Elias laughed, really laughed, it sounded like wind chimes, high and free. But when he was thoughtful, when he asked one of his endless questions about stars or wings or how do bees know where home is, he used the same measured cadence the man used when ordering coffee. And Nina couldn't unhear it anymore. It was mid-April when she learned his name without asking. A delivery guy dropped a clipboard near his table. Apologizing in a rush. The man signed for a package, handed it back, and the label was left turned just enough for her to see. Dr. Nolan Vance. She nearly dropped the tamper. Dr. Vance. The name sounded like a bell that had rung before. She didn't have to think hard to remember it. The same last name had been on the donor registry printout years ago. She never knew if it was real. They blurred names, changed small details. But the moment she saw it, her breath caught. She avoided him for the rest of the day. The next morning, she told herself she was being irrational. Plenty of people have the same last name. Plenty of men have that kind of stare. But when he looked up from his screen and Elias, there early because preschool was closed, ran to her behind the counter and said, "Mama, I drew a picture of a rocket." Something in Nolan's face shifted. A slow, strange kind of recognition. He said nothing, asked nothing, but his eyes followed Elias longer than before. And for the first time, when he stood to leave, he looked directly at her. "Your son's sharp. That's rare." She forced a smile. "He notices everything. Wonder where he gets it from," he said, almost to himself. Then he walked out. Nina stood motionless for a long time, her hands trembling just slightly where no one could see. That night, when Elias curled beside her on the couch, she watched his face for answers she didn't know how to form into questions. And in her mind, the silence of the clinic years ago came rushing back, clean halls, cold lights, and the silent hope that she could start a family alone. But what if she hadn't? What if the man who kept sitting in the corner of her cafe, drinking espresso and glancing just a little too long, wasn't a stranger at all? She didn't sleep that night. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. More like the slow hum of something shifting under her feet, too subtle to call an earthquake, too constant to ignore. Elias slept soundly in the next room, a stuffed fox tucked beneath his arm, one sock off as usual. She sat at the edge of her bed, knees tucked under her, staring at the folder she hadn't opened in over 4 years. She'd kept it in a box of hospital papers, ultrasounds, payment plans, things that felt clinical at the time but sacred now. The donor sheet was still there, mostly redacted. Profile number 2461. Fields like education, languages spoken, family medical history, and a small note. Donor has an academic background in genetics, minor in linguistics. Personality, quiet, introspective. Interests, travel, long-distance running, astronomy. She remembered reading that and thinking, he sounds like someone who's alone a lot. Like me. There was no name, no photo, but the voice in her head whispered anyway. Nolan Vance. The next morning, she almost didn't go downstairs. She thought about calling Lena, saying Elias had a fever, saying she needed the day off. But instead, she tied her apron and opened the cafe like nothing inside her had changed. The sun was sharp through the windows. The air smelled like cinnamon and steam. And her heartbeat echoed louder than the grinder. He didn't come. Nor the next day. By Friday, she was angry at herself for noticing. Angry that she'd memorized his drink order, his rhythm, the way he tapped the edge of the cup with his index finger twice before taking a sip. Angry that she'd allowed herself even a moment of fantasy. Then Saturday came. It was raining and the early shift was quiet. Just a few soaked commuters and a couple reading in the corner. Elias sat behind the counter on a cushion, drawing clouds with chalk on black paper. Nina made herself a strong tea, stood at the window to watch the mist, and told herself it was fine. She didn't need anyone. The door chimed. She didn't turn at first. Just wiped her hands, reset a cup. But when she looked up and saw him, hair damp from the rain, jacket half-zipped, no laptop, something inside her stilled. He didn't go to his table. He walked directly to the counter. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Nina blinked. "For what?" He hesitated. "For disappearing. I had to leave town unexpectedly." She nodded once. "It's fine." But it wasn't. And somehow he knew that. He looked down at Elias, then back at her. "May I ask something strange?" Nina's stomach twisted. "Depends how strange." His voice lowered. "What's your son's last name?" There it was. Not subtle. Not even cautious. She exhaled. "It's just mine. Rivers." He studied her face. "No father." Nina paused. Not in the way you're thinking. A quiet breath passed between them. I'm asking because he reminds me of someone. She didn't flinch. Yourself. He didn't smile. Yes. Nina looked at him fully then. For the first time, without the safety of the counter or the noise or the comfort of denial. You're not imagining it. Nolan's expression didn't change right away. He blinked, slowly, like his brain had to catch up to the words. I was a donor, she said almost inaudibly. 4.5 years ago. Anonymous. No contact. His hands curled slightly at his sides. I didn't know who you were until I saw your name on that package. Jesus, he breathed. I didn't plan this. I know. I didn't even want to know who the donor was. That was the point. He nodded. Then again. Slowly. Mechanically. Elias looked up at them, blinking at the tension. Mama? Can I have another chalk? She knelt beside him, kissed his forehead, and handed him the small tin of colored sticks. Her hands were shaking. Nolan sat at the corner stool. Do you want me to leave? He asked. I don't know. Do you want me to stay? I don't know that either. He looked at the boy again. He's amazing. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. He is. Do you talk to him about his dad? No. I told him he's a science baby. That made Nolan actually smile. Smart. I figured he'd ask someday, but he never did. He just exists with this quiet certainty, like he chose me. Nolan's voice dropped. Maybe he did. They didn't speak again for a long moment. She refilled his espresso without asking. He sipped it with a kind of reverence, as if it were anchoring him in the moment. I didn't think those donations ever went anywhere, he said quietly. I did it in grad school. It felt abstract. Well, she said softly, you're not abstract anymore. The rain softened against the windows. Elias hummed to himself, pressing white chalk clouds into the paper, completely unaware of how close the world was to shifting again. Nolan looked at Nina. I'm not here to take anything from you. I know. But if you'll let me, I'd like to know him, even if it's from a distance. She didn't answer. Not yet. She just watched as her son looked up, smiled, and handed the man his drawing. It's a sky, Elias said simply. That's where everything starts. Nolan took the picture in both hands, and something in his expression cracked just slightly. Thank you, he said, and Elias, calm, direct, a little boy who barely let strangers close, replied without pause, You're welcome, Skyman. Nina laughed, quietly. She couldn't help it. And Nolan? He held onto the paper like it meant something. Nina didn't tell anyone. Not Lena. Not the neighbor upstairs. Not even her best friend Amira, who'd once held her hand through the clinic paperwork and brought her broth when morning sickness hit hard. Some truths needed space to breathe before being spoken aloud. But the silence didn't mean stillness. Nolan began coming in more often. Not every day, but regularly enough that it felt intentional. Sometimes he brought his laptop again. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he asked for a second espresso for the road and lingered 10 extra minutes just to watch Elias build towers from sugar packets. Other times, he left before he finished his drink. A storm in his eyes she didn't dare ask about. He never pushed, never mentioned the word father, never referred to the donation, but he always looked at Elias like the boy held something sacred. And Elias, as if drawn by something neither of them understood, slowly began to gravitate toward him. One Wednesday morning, Nina came down to open the cafe and found a drawing taped to the door. Crayon lines, bright colors, the sun with sunglasses and a smiling cup of coffee labeled Sky Man's Cafe in wobbly handwriting. No signature, but she knew exactly who it came from. When Nolan arrived 2 hours later, she handed it to him with one eyebrow raised. He wanted to surprise you. He studied the drawing like it was a classified document, then carefully folded it and placed it in his jacket pocket. Tell him it worked, he said. They fell into a rhythm neither dared define. Nolan would stop by mid-morning, sometimes just for 5 minutes. He brought books once, children's science books with illustrations of planets and weather systems. Elias devoured them, asking questions with growing complexity. Nina caught herself smiling too much, catching her breath when Nolan laughed softly, wondering what it meant that she wanted to keep seeing that look on his face. And then came the day everything cracked wider. Elias fell sick. It started with a cough, then a fever, then a night of restless tossing, his little body hot and shivering against her side. She took him to urgent care the next morning, expecting the usual virus, maybe antibiotics. Instead, she got a long pause from the doctor and an order to head to the children's hospital for scans. Just precaution, they said. She heard panic anyway. She barely remembered texting Nolan. She didn't mean to. She meant to message Lena. But her fingers typed his name. Maybe because somewhere deep down she wanted him there. He showed up 20 minutes later. No questions. No judgment. Just presence. At the hospital, he stayed in the hallway while Elias was examined. Nina sat curled on a plastic bench, hands gripping the coffee he brought her. It was the wrong kind, too sweet, too light, but she drank it anyway. When the doctor finally emerged and said it was a severe respiratory virus, treatable with oxygen and rest, Nina let out a breath so sharp it felt like it cut her lungs on the way out. She didn't cry. Not then. But Nolan did something unexpected. He reached over, slow and careful, and took her hand. Not with urgency. Not with pity. Just steady warmth. A tether to pull her back into her body. He's strong, he said quietly. You are too. That night, they sat in the hospital room while Elias dozed in a haze of medicine and cartoons. Nolan took the recliner. Nina curled in the visitor chair with her knees pulled up. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. At some point past midnight, Elias stirred. His voice was thin and sleepy. Did Skyman stay? Nolan leaned closer. I did. Okay, Elias mumbled, eyes already closing again. You can stay. I like your voice. Nina didn't say anything. Her throat ached too much to form words. In the early morning hours, when the machines beeped quietly and the world outside was still dark, Nolan said softly, I don't know how to be a parent. She turned to him. I was raised by people who thought presence was a luxury, he continued. I don't have a model for this. You don't need one, she whispered. He doesn't need perfection. He needs consistency. I don't want to confuse him. Then don't. Just be what he already sees. He looked at her, eyes heavier than usual. And what do you see? She didn't look away. Someone who shows up. He nodded slowly. That's new for me. The next day, Elias' fever began to drop. He sat up in bed, asked for crackers, and tried to build a spaceship from the box juice straws. Nina watched Nolan watch him, the gentleness in his posture, the wonder in his eyes. And for the first time, the question that had haunted her for weeks stopped feeling like a threat. What if he's meant to be here? When they were discharged 2 days later, Nolan offered to drive them home. Elias insisted on sitting behind his seat. So I can see your ear, he said. Nolan took it as a compliment. At home, Nina tucked her son into the couch, turned on cartoons, and stood beside the window, arms crossed. You can stay for tea, she said without looking at him. I'd like that. They sat in the kitchen, mugs between their hands. The silence wasn't awkward. Just quiet. Settled. I don't want this to get messy, she said finally. Neither do I. But this isn't simple. No, he agreed. It's not. And yet neither of them moved. Elias called from the couch, "Sky Man, can you help me build a pillow rocket?" Nolan looked at Nina. She nodded. He rose without hesitation. And that night, Nina stood in the doorway as her son laughed and leapt onto a pillow mountain, Nolan waiting to catch him. The sound filled the apartment like music, like memory, like something unspoken and beginning. She didn't know what this was yet, but she knew it was real. The days that followed unfolded not with fanfare, but with something softer. A rhythm, a pattern, like the slow settling of snow after a storm. Nolan started coming by after work, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with books for Elias. Once he brought a battered telescope from his attic, saying it still worked most nights if you aimed it right. Elias was enthralled. They spent an entire evening on the balcony squinting at the moon and arguing whether Saturn had more than 5 rings. Nina watched them from the kitchen, her hands motionless in the sink. There was a joy in her son's voice she hadn't heard before, not louder but wider. Like his world had stretched open and found a place to rest. They never called it anything. Not parenting. Not co-parenting. Not dating. There were no labels between her and Nolan, just cups of tea, glances that lingered too long, and the growing ease of silence shared without tension. One night, after Elias fell asleep with a book open on his chest, Nolan stayed behind to help clean up the blanket fort in the living room. Nina knelt to gather socks and crayon bits. Nolan folded the throw pillows. When their hands met over a fallen toy, neither pulled away. She looked up. "So," he said, voice low, "this is what domesticity feels like." She smiled faintly. "Less glamorous than your lab, I imagine." "Way less. And way more terrifying." "Why terrifying?" He didn't answer right away. "Then, because I keep waiting to mess it up." Nina sat back on her heels. "You haven't. Yet." She reached for a blanket and shook it out. "Nolan, you didn't ask for this." "I didn't know I could." He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt the room tilt. Like there was something building in the silence between them that neither had named yet. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," he said. "There's no one to replace," she replied, and the words landed heavier than she expected. "It was always just me. And him." Nolan swallowed. "Would you ever tell him? About me?" "I don't know. Maybe someday. When he's old enough to ask. When I know how to answer without confusing him." He nodded. "Then I'll wait." "For what?" "For that day." It rained again the following week, a spring downpour that left the streets glistening and the windows fogged. Nolan arrived soaked through, his umbrella forgotten, curls dripping onto his collar. Elias laughed when he saw him. "Sky Man, you look like a sea monster." Nolan roared dramatically. "I have come for your planet." They built a rocket out of cardboard boxes that evening. Nina made grilled cheese. When Elias finally fell asleep mid-launch, Nolan stayed behind to help sweep up glitter and crumbs. As she rinsed plates, he leaned against the counter. "I've been thinking." "That's dangerous," she teased. "I mean it." She turned to him, drying her hands. "About what?" "About the fact that I don't want to be temporary." Her breath caught. He wasn't looking at her now, just down at his hands. "I don't mean to push," he said quickly. "I know this is delicate. But I also know that every time I leave, I want to come back. And not just for him." Nina folded the towel slowly. "You're not just here because of biology." "No. I'm here because this," he gestured at the quiet apartment, at the folded blanket on the couch, at the paper star Elias had taped to the lamp, "feels more real than anything I've built alone." She stood frozen. Then, quietly, she asked, "Do you regret it? Donating?" He shook his head. "I regret not knowing sooner. But if I had, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Maybe we wouldn't be here." "And now?" He met her eyes. "Now, I'm afraid to hope too much." She stepped closer, slowly. "You're not the only one." He reached out gently, fingertips brushing her wrist. But before either could say another word, a small voice interrupted them. "Are you my dad?" They both turned. Elias stood in the doorway, half asleep, hair tousled, one sock on backward. His eyes were wide, not afraid, just curious. like a scientist forming a hypothesis he wasn't quite ready to prove. Nina froze. Nolan knelt slowly. What makes you ask that? The boy shrugged. Mama said I was made by science. You know a lot about science. And you look like me. Nolan glanced at Nina. She nodded barely. He looked back at Elias. I'm someone who helped your mama a long time ago. And I care about you. A lot. Like a dad. Maybe something like that. Elias seemed to consider this. Okay. Then, with the logic of a child satisfied, he climbed into Nolan's lap and fell asleep again without another word. Nina stared at them, her son curled into a man she had never planned for, but who now felt like something inevitable. Later, when she tucked Elias back into bed and returned to the kitchen, Nolan stood at the window. He knows, she said. He senses. Is that enough for now? He turned to her. It has to be. She stepped closer, laid her hand gently on his chest. And in the hush of the hour, no labels were spoken. Only truths felt. The weeks that followed were filled with soft things. Afternoon walks to the park. Lazy Saturdays with pancakes and finger paint. Nolan reading aloud while Elias fell asleep mid-sentence. Nina catching herself smiling more easily, laughing without checking if she was allowed. There were no grand declarations. No sudden decisions. Only a slow, steady folding of lives into each other. Nina found herself reaching for 2 mugs instead of 1. Keeping Nolan's favorite tea in the cupboard. Smiling when she noticed his coat still hanging by the door. She hadn't asked him to leave it. He hadn't asked if he could stay longer. But neither of them brought it up. Some things didn't need permission, they just needed time. One Friday evening, Elias sat between them on the couch, surrounded by books and stuffed animals. A cartoon hummed in the background, but he wasn't watching. He was carefully building something with popsicle sticks and glue, a DNA tower, he said. Nolan looked like he might cry and laugh at once. That's beautiful, he said. Elias beamed. Mama says I got my brain from her and my curiosity from the stars. And what about from me? Nolan asked gently. The boy paused. Thought. You brought the telescope. Nolan smiled. Fair enough. That night, after Elias had gone to bed, Nina and Nolan sat on the balcony in the fading summer light. The city buzzed below them, but up here, everything was still. I talked to someone at the clinic, he said quietly. She turned to him. I wanted to understand what I signed away back then. What rights I don't have. What expectations I'm not allowed to carry. Her stomach tightened, but she said nothing. I didn't go to fight, he added. I went because I needed to make peace with the version of myself who thought he'd never want a family. Nina folded her arms against the chill in the air. And did you? He nodded. I forgave him. But I'm not him anymore. Silence stretched, comfortable. I'm not asking for custody, he said. Or titles. Or control. I know. I just want to be someone Elias knows will never leave. And I want to earn that. Day by day. Year by year. She looked at him, heart loud in her chest. You already are. Nolan reached for her hand. Then let me be that for you too. Nina didn't speak. She just leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his, and breathed in the quiet promise hanging between them. Later that summer, Elias's preschool held a family picnic. Parents brought blankets and juice boxes, sun hats, and folding chairs. Kids ran barefoot, sticky with watermelon. When a teacher asked Elias who'd be picking him up, he pointed matter-of-factly across the field. That's my mom, he said. And that's Nolan. He's not my dad, but he kind of is. The teacher smiled. That's special. Yeah, Elias said. We're a science family. Nina and Nolan stood beneath the shade of a tree, watching him dart through the grass. Nolan's hand found hers. We didn't plan this, she said. No, he replied, I soft. But I think this found us anyway. She smiled. And I don't want it any other way. That evening, Elias fell asleep in the back seat with grass stains on his knees and a half-eaten sandwich in his hand. Nolan carried him upstairs, tucked him in without waking him, and stood there for a long time after, just watching. Nina joined him. He dreams out loud sometimes, she whispered. I know. You've stayed longer than I expected. I'm not done staying. She looked at him. Then stay. He turned to her, kissed her gently, not as a declaration, but as a continuation. And when morning came, they woke to the sound of small feet running toward the kitchen, demanding pancakes and glitter. The world outside stayed noisy, uncertain. But in that small apartment above the café, a quiet, steady kind of love had taken root. Not because of DNA, not because of fate, but because somewhere between a cup of coffee and a question no one expected, 3 people had chosen each other. Again, and again, and again.